This is not a particularly easy subject to speak to because it does draw on personal lived experience, and I'm making reference to something that is quite fresh in my memory, but I'm not speaking from inside of the experience. I would say it's now a few steps removed, which makes it easier to kind of look back reflectively and also further to be a transmission which articulates better and articulates from a place of emotional clarity, and also communicating from a position of safety, autonomically speaking, which I think is important when we're highlighting things that are difficult and challenging. It is very easy to communicate and express from that place, and then considering if that is the most helpful and healthy for you as an individual, but also in terms of how that information and that message might reach other and the kind of impact that has. That is also something that I consider more now when speaking to or about trauma and speaking to the challenges of trying to navigate spaces which are asserting that they are trauma informed, but then perhaps having a different experience from the perspective of a service user. And it makes it doubly complex when, you know, you're there on an individual level, intersecting with different services or avenues of support, but then there's also a dimension of your professional life and knowledge and awareness and expertise to bring into your reference point and understanding of space holding and what equates to supportive space holding and space holding that makes someone feel safe. And it has brought me to this place of feeling that it's important to say that having the theoretical understanding of an awareness of what it means to work in a trauma-informed way, that looks very different when you actually have to hold space for someone who has experienced trauma and is still experiencing the after effects of that. Because knowing the language, knowing possible contributing factors as to why somebody might feel uncomfortable in a space, none of that is the same as actually making adjustments and being responsive to a real person in a room, and also working with your own nervous system to actually provide cues of safety to an individual that is in a vulnerable position, and also having the skill to be able to actually read the signs and the indicators there which would help inform you as to what response they might actually be in. So all of this to say that having a kind of a principle or an ethos of working in that way is not the same as actually having specialist skills or knowledge to be able to realistically hold a quality of space for someone that might need that additional support. And it's difficult. This is a difficult conversation because of the fact that there are, two branches or two influences that come into this for me, as I've said: personal lived experience, being the individual that is asking for support or indicating that support is required, and then the professional aspect of knowing actually what is involved to put that support in place, and then the actual experience of then navigating an environment that doesn't actually meet your needs, which is a personal reflection, but then you also happen to have the knowledge and understanding about how frameworks and systems are either applying these principles to working or not, or are only actually going halfway to addressing that additional support need, because it is an additional support need and it's a complex one. It does require more resources, does require more time, and I think that's probably one of the primary reasons that the kind of more involved implementation of actually putting these things into practice rather than just having them as a reference point to, I've done a training on that, I'm aware of, it's so different to actually translating that to behavioural adjustments and reasonable adjustments of space that put the individual that needs support at the front and centre of that conversation in regards to transparency, in regards to consent, in regards to understanding what the dynamics of a space is, so that that individual can make reasonable preparations to best support themselves going into a space, should they encounter a situation where actually that environment and the people in that environment don't have the adequate skills to offer that support. So being prepared and having knowledge ahead of time can be so helpful then for an individual to think about, how can I best support and care for myself going into this space, interacting with this environment and these structures, and then come away again and be able to find ways to support oneself and return to a feeling of safety if there has been any kind of disruption to that. And by no means is any environment perfect. But there are also things that are just incredibly practical, which can be really supportive. And when an individual is going into an environment that they don't actually have any control over, the parameters there are kind of part of a different ecosystem, that is already a potential source of discomfort and disorientation for someone coming into that space. So very, very practical adjustments can be made that are actually about hospitality and about creating a kind of an atmosphere of welcome, and an atmosphere that is not fearful, in terms of, if you're in a position where you know that you have to engage with someone that has kind of additional support needs related to trauma, and you don't feel comfortable with that, or you don't feel equipped for that, it's possible that you're not the right person to be having that conversation. And I think organizations there's a lot of pressure, to meet needs with limited resource and high demand on services. And that is also something that maybe comes from a kind of structural level, but it does trickle down, and it does have an impact on the end user, the service user that's actually engaging with that space. So I just felt it was important to speak to this, from an experiential point of view, and not to be inherently critical, or to make a complaint in that respect, but just acknowledging that it is challenging. It is challenging, but there are also reasonable adjustments that can be made that reduce risk to an individual with lived experience of trauma coming into an environment that could otherwise be challenging, uncomfortable, and problematic, because there is a kind of a hierarchy and a power structure within that environment that is by default challenging to engage with. So yeah, I'm coming back to this piece on transparency and empowering the individual that is coming into that space with knowledge and awareness, not an overload of information by any means, but depending on that individual, depending on their learning style, depending on their temperament, depending on their intellect, it might be more empowering for that person to have clarity on what to expect, like a schedule, how things are going to flow, because that, from a performance practice point of view, you are then able to rehearse from a central nervous system perspective, how am I going to intersect with that space? It gives you then cues as to, there may be certain trigger points there that are not within my control, but having some ability to anticipate those can make such a difference in terms of how you enter that space, knowing what lies before you.